A very good evening. I should have known it wasn't a risk to do a talk so close to Christmas with these two wonderful gentlemen, but I did admit when we chose the date of December the 15th, we did have a brief thought, will anyone come? It's Christmas party season, but I'm really happy that there are some non-Philistines in the world, and you're all here this evening. This time of year was Joseph Cornell's favorite time of year. The nights are long. It's a chance to give presents to people, which Cornell loved to do. It was a chance to eat cake, which Cornell did every day of the year, but at Christmas time it was more acceptable. And it was also his birthday on December the 24th. So this evening is an early birthday present for Joseph. It was also a special time for him because during his entire life, all of his gallerists only gave him exhibitions at Christmas time. Peggy Guggenheim, Leo Castelli, Julian Levy, because they all thought that his objects and boxes made perfect Christmas presents. So we wanted to mark the occasion with something very special, and we have invited these two wonderful gentlemen to speak this evening. Further away from me, I'm delighted to welcome from Istanbul, Orhan Pamuk. I'm very jealous of the audience that you have tonight. When I'm up on the stage, I never get these kinds of rounds of applause. Novelist, screenwriter, a tireless advocate of human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, a recipient of many, many awards, most notable of which is the 2006 Nobel Prize in Literature, professor in humanities at Columbia University, and someone who's been writing regularly since 1974. The book that really turned the light bulb on in my mind, and I think many of the minds here, was the 2008 book, The Museum of Innocence. And Orhan will begin this evening by talking alone for around 15 minutes about his life and his work and his projects and the particular resonance that they have in the context of museums, of collecting, and of Joseph Cornell. And just to introduce Philipp very briefly, he needs very little introduction to an audience here. Philipp is also a novelist and an historian and also a winner of many, many awards. His books, The Vertigo Years, The Wicked Company, a wonderful book about collecting called To Have and to Hold, an intimate history of collecting and collectors. We read his columns regularly in newspapers and magazines here in Vienna. He holds a regular discussion program on Eins, and together with his wonderful wife, Veronica, who's here somewhere, he is in the process of finishing off a wonderful new guidebook to the Kunsthistorisches Museum collections, which will be launched in February of next year. So Orhan is going to speak briefly, and then there will be a conversation between the two, and at the end there will be a chance for all of you to ask questions.
Good night. So happy to be here. What makes us come together here tonight is Joseph Cornell and our admiration for his work. My admiration to visual artists are not scholarly. I am a pseudo-scholar teaching literature at Columbia University, but as an artist, I am more like a child. I'll explain to you my childishness, what I did, perhaps influenced by Cornell. In 2008, I published a book in Turkish. Now you see the German version, Museum of Innocence. In 2012, I opened a museum in Istanbul called Museum of Innocence. And in the same year, I published a catalog, as you see here, the innocence of objects, but forget about the catalog. I conceive the novel and the museum together with the pretext that all the objects in a fictional story in the novel will be displayed in a museum one day, and I will publish the novel and the museum the day the museum opens, with the idea, with an experimental idea that that the novel will be more or less an annotated catalog of the museum, where the annotations are put in a sequence and manipulated in such a way that it reads like a novel without pictures. Shall I repeat? That I conceived the novel and the museum together with the idea of opening the museum the same day the novel is published, and the form or the shape of the novel will be an annotated catalog of a museum without pictures, but the annotations and the sequence of the annotations will be manipulated in such a way that it reads like a novel. But it took more years, more time to open the museum. I saw that I was managing the novel, but I realized that it will take more time because the painter never comes, architect is lazy, the other guy is not doing his job on time, while I was writing the novel by myself. Then I finished the novel in 2008 and decided to publish it. Then it took me another 4 years to finish the museum and open it. The day I opened the museum, I decided that, or before opening the museum, I decided that the novel now reads like a classical novel. I really need a real catalog with pictures. Also, the same year, in 2012, I published this catalog, which is more or less like a real catalog with a lot of literary pretensions. Bing. Okay. When I had this idea that of opening a museum based on opening a museum based on a fictional story, but exhibiting all the objects, landscapes, photos, ephemera, films, postcards, whatever you need to survive in Istanbul between 1950s and 2000, a sort of a modest city museum. I had this idea, but if you have deep, radical, artistic ideas, don't tell anyone till you believe them. When do you realize that you believe in your idea? When you acquire the first object. You may look at my museum as a sort of an installation, and the first object of my collection was this building you see on the right. This was a worn-out building in Çukurcuma, a neighborhood very close to my office, and some 8 years after that, I opened a museum there where all the objects in the fictional story were displayed. Here is a general look from the second floor of the museum. You see on the left side below the first floor, where there is a sort of a big cigarette butts collection, where in the novel there is a middle-class character, upper middle-class character, who is in love with his twice removed cousin who comes from the poor branch of the family. He is so much infatuated by his love that he collects everything she touches. Here on the first floor, below down, you see the cigarette butts. He collected her cigarette butts. We have a general picture of the second floor, and you see on the left-hand corner up above the third floor. Maybe one or two words about perhaps chronicling my problems when I did the museum was this, that yes, in a way, I wrote the novel as I collected the real objects, or produced the real objects that my fictional characters touched. But then, how do I display them? What's the logic of display? At early stages of making of the museum, I decided that there will be a sort of a Joseph Cornell kind of, or a window, or a display window, or a vitrine, which corresponds to each chapter of the novel. So, if the chapter ends, the name of that unit, painting, box, whatever, will be the title of that chapter. In fact, we have now replicas of some of the boxes that I like. So this is a general picture of the second floor. As we were this afternoon going around and looking at wonderful Joseph Cornell boxes with Jasper, the curator of this wonderful Joseph Cornell exhibition, I come across, I don't know, something Cornell said about his work. He said this poetic word, which I like, which is also religious, epiphany. He said he used the word which James Joyce also liked, epiphany. A moment, a poetic moment, a moment of revelation, and I associated something like epiphany with my museum. I argued, did a sort of a tongue-in-cheek, maybe, childlike, Cornell childlike, and sort of a poetics of my museum, referring to Aristotle. Aristotle, as we all know, has a theory of atoms, that atoms are the irreducible and the indivisible matter, that you cannot divide them. He also developed a very parallel theory, Aristotle, in his physics. I always read Aristotle's physics in my spare time. He also developed a theory of time. The indivisible moments of time are called, in Aristotle's theory, moments, and what connects moments, that line that connects moments in Aristotle's physics is called time. And then time goes in spirals, and I argue my tongue-in-cheek, ironical theory of museums, time, objects, memory, epiphanies is that every object in my story corresponds to a certain time, certain event, certain chapter, certain scene. When you put them together, you make both a novel and a story. Stories move in time, as we all know. These are the objects that I was hanging around, using, collecting as I wrote the novel, because my characters were all using them. Then I finished the novel in between 2008 and 2012. I worked with various artists to produce my Cornell-like vitrines, boxes, units from these objects. All of these objects you see here, a random photo shot, are mentioned, the story touches them. Here is a general photo from the second floor of the museum. Again, I also had a modest ambition of making my museum look like a sort of a museum of, city museum of modest bourgeois life of Istanbul between 1940s, 50s to today. One of the reasons that it took me so much time, 4 years, to open the museum after publishing the novel was, in fact, artistic. I wanted to be a painter between the ages of 7 and 22, but a screw was loose in my head as I wrote in my autobiographical book, Istanbul, and I decided to be a novelist. I won't go to that direction, but the dead artist inside me, or I killed the ambition to be the person in me who wanted to be a painter and insisted that I be a writer. But when I was making this museum, that artistic person resurrected, claimed that I thought that at the beginning I would exhibit my objects like in a flat contemporary art exhibition. Everything will be on a table and you come and see the objects, just giving a sense of fiction and reality. But then the ambitious side of me took over. Then I decided that I will compose the units one by one. That's why it took another 4 years to finish the novel. Now, the artist in me took over and took the writer's time. You see on the right side my sketches for making this box number 47. My notes, I was also working with assistants, with artists, designers, how to place all the things. This chapter of the novel is called 47th chapter of the novel, Museum of Innocence, is called My Father's Death, more or less, and the novel has also autobiographical aspects. More or less, this chapter is very close to my father, or the main character of Museum of Innocence. Here, you see, I made a design, I draw, even when I was writing the novel. More or less, the methods of putting the objects in units, in Cornell-like boxes, my boxes are much more bigger. And when I decide to put all the objects inside, then I always thought that they should look nice. I was very worried about that. One way of doing is, as you saw, drawing. Another way of doing is just simple try and error. Art is first planning, designing before, or try and error. Here we took a lot of photos, working with assistants, placing the objects, not liking them, continuing on and on. This is the unit, the box I like very much, very Cornelian, very Joseph Cornell-like. And also, now that we have seen the Wunderkammer downstairs, it has also all the qualities of a Wunderkammer. Strange fish shells from outer world, which has a function in the novel. Gigantic size teacups, ashtrays, all mentioned in that chapter of the book. And here it is, my little introduction to Museum of Innocence, which I opened in 2008 in Istanbul, is over. Now we're going to talk about more deeper, more serious matters. Let's see what Philipp will ask me.
Well, Orhan, thank you so much for that beautiful glimpse into your museum. I can't promise that I'll ask you anything more serious. But one thing occurred to me. I was lucky to walk around this afternoon through the exhibition and then through the Kunstkammer together with Orhan Pamuk, and he was commenting and he was interested in certain aspects. Now, the Kunstkammer comes from a time when objects were seen in a very different way than we have today. And one thing that was then very much in fashion is something that seems to me quite close to the art of a novelist. It was called back then a theater of memory. You arranged objects in space so that you could organize your memories, organize your thoughts, but perhaps you can also, of course, dramatize memories, make memories out of that.
When I started making the museum, I used to go to Amazon and click the museology. There were only 20 books or 30 books. Now, if you do that, there are 3,000 books, whatever. The books on museology was not around, and Cabinet of Curiosities or Wunderkammers was interesting for me because I wanted to treat the normal daily life of middle class, upper middle class Istanbul, people of Istanbul in such a way, distancing them as if they're very ordinary, very boring, very typical. They all watch TV at 10 o'clock every day, eating, enjoying their dinner in such a way, alienate them, a sort of an effect of alienation, as if it was what they are doing deserves to be a Wunderkammer, while actually they're eating just regular food. Nothing is amazing as in a Wunderkammer, while I'm phrasing these ordinary things as perhaps Cornell did, as if they were something from a king's cabinet of curiosities.
But that is a very curious connection, the connection between the ordinary and the extraordinary. You showed us a slide here, and there was a tea glass there, as you can buy them in any Viennese supermarket and a Turkish supermarket for 10 cents a glass. But now it has become an object with a great significance.
Okay. In fact, the logic of all art is making familiar unfamiliar, making unfamiliar familiar, or the tongue-in-cheek logic of creative writing is saying the dramatical things in such a way that it looks very normal, or saying grotesque, abnormal, strange, surrealistic things in a tongue-in-cheek, low way. In fact, artistic creativity is managing of these dramatical moments. I was, in fact, using all the effects of Wunderkammer, Cabinet of Curiosities, museology, framing, frame inside a frame, inside a frame, just to show an insect or and a little object, but the total effect counted was very important.
Now I have to say that not because I want to be nice, but because I think it's true. This Cornell exhibition is really an amazing moment for Vienna. It really opens up the Viennese art world to the art world of the world, and it creates an extraordinary dialogue between modern art and the art of many centuries ago. But the question I have is, when did you discover this artist? You made many remarks in the exhibition that you had seen something before, that you'd seen something in somebody's place, but...
I really don't know. It's like asking, when did you see your first Van Gogh, or when did you see...
that far back.
Yes, that far back. And in fact, as I was doing research for this conversation, that I realized that emergence of Cornell's fame. I always thought he was famous all the time, but now I understand. I can't say that when I first came across Cornell, but I should say this. Living in Istanbul all my life, I came across art in books, not even in internet. So probably I saw his boxes in books, probably surrealistic art or whatever. I don't remember when I came across first at the time, but also I should warn you that Cornell always looks nice in catalogs and books. There are artists, when you see the painting you say, or when you see the sculpture, when you see the piece of work you say, wow, it's so beautiful than the book. While when you look at the Cornell box in a book, it may look even sometimes better than reality.
There is art that you need to get into, you need to see many times, that perhaps you need to have explained, and there is art across the styles, across the centuries, that you feel immediately, this thing speaks my language. Which was it for you with the works of Cornell?
I don't know. It was, I would say, love at first sight, perhaps, or there are so many other writers who were influenced by somehow, or whose imaginations were triggered by his work. I don't know the reasons. They just look nice. Of course, that's obvious. But another thing is perhaps putting different things from different sources nicely, composing, paying attention to details by the side, never being academic, a sort of objects from our daily lives put on a pedestal or put in a box as if they were parts of a Wunderkammer, as if they were extraordinary objects, treating daily life objects in such a way that you have this uncanny feeling of they are more than themselves. Someone had seen that these objects has an aura that I have not noticed. that the light, the composition, the background, the artist's intentions, the gravitas of the whole frame lends a second or a third meaning to these objects because of the composition, because of the balance, because of the light, because of the insistence of the artistic imagination. It lends these daily life objects a sort of a dignity that they lack when they are all by themselves. Cornell, in that sense, is perhaps one of the most successful pop artists in the sense that our daily life objects are highlighted, gains a more gravitas, an aura, which we expect from art to lend this spirit.
When we were walking through the exhibition, we, or at least I, learned how many artists, and especially pop artists, Cornell inspired. This little retiring man who never gave interviews, who is seen in film only. There's a film in the exhibition from above in his courtyard working away because he wouldn't speak to a camera. And yet he manages to make these things extraordinary. And here comes a difficulty for an interviewer, because the parallels between this museum and writing a novel are so strong that it's almost redundant to comment on them. For instance, Cornell makes dossiers about imaginary people, and he lovingly collects evidence of their daily existence and who they were and what they did, but they never existed. One has a feeling that Cornell writes novels in objects.
Wow, there are so many subjects that I want to explore here. First, the desire to write a novel and a desire to make frames like Cornell's, or making museums of modest museums like my Museum of Innocence have something in common. That is, putting the objects or details that are described in literature, visual, verbal details of our daily lives or objects of our daily life. We would be so happy if those ephemera or words and objects are preserved in an artistic way. I'll tell you my experience. If I write a novel, my characters take a bus and wait in a bus stop. If I write that bus stop at one certain particular bus stop that exists in Istanbul, everyone loves it. Why? Because they take a bus in that bus stop? No. Everyone wants his or her memories, daily life, objects, images to be preserved, put in a work of art, put in a pedestal, put in a museum. Novels are also about that, how we go to work, how we take a bus, how we go to movies, how we eat, what we eat, how we talk, how we dream. Everything in a novel is a sort of, if that's a successful novel, that will be a beautiful novel, is an attempt to preserve details of our lives. Novels and museums have one thing in common, a desire to preserve, to save, put in a frame, highlight the details of our lives, whether verbal details, visual details, or objects themselves.
It's surely apocryphal, but it's still very nice. When asked how to make a successful sculpture, Michelangelo is supposed to have said, well, you just take a block of marble and you hack away everything that's superfluous, and you're just left with, what's necessary. But surely the art is exactly in deciding what's necessary. When you look at many of Cornell's boxes, nothing seems necessary, but the ensemble seems absolutely perfect.
I understand, more or less, writing fiction is also deleting unnecessary. But then, my temperament is not like, my imagination is encyclopedic. I write and write and write, delete and delete and delete. Write and write and write, carve out and carve out and carve out. Write, 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 and the composition and the center of the composition continuously changes. In the end, you delete and write more. You delete and write more. Not everyone has Michelangelo's stones. In the end, writing is that you can have more stones. There is no limit to human imagination. The desire to write encyclopedic novels, or the desire to put everything into a museum. These are parallel, similar sentiments.
One perhaps less obvious, but I think very important aspect is your novel, The Museum of Innocence, is the novel about a love affair. It starts with a beautiful scene of two people making love, two people who start laughing because they realize that outside in a schoolyard kids are playing football and they're all boys and they're insulting each other in very vulgar ways, and the protagonist finds that everything they're shouting to each other they're doing inside. But this creates, I think, a very important connection, namely a connection between memory and objects in display and objects in narration and eros. It is a very sexual, a very erotic activity. You see that in Joseph Cornell, this very retiring man who never had lovers, who always lived with his mother, but you feel the erotic charge of these objects. You see the amount of beautiful girls he puts into his compositions.
Museum of Innocence, as a novel, yes, is a novel about love. It's a love story between an upper middle class, secular Istanbul bourgeois, whose background is more or less close to me, whose age, my protagonist is 5 years older than me. While he falls in love with his twice removed cousin, she is not doesn't have the family. Her mother is a tailor, her father is a retired school teacher, and they don't have much money. And my upper class proper character is about to marry a proper girl, while he falls in love, enjoys sex with his twice removed cousin. There is the subject about the cult of virginity, problems about that. That's why the title of the novel is Museum of Innocence, so forth and so on. But there is not, I confess, there is not much eroticism in my novel, though. My main character's sexuality is suppressed, and in fact, he projects it to the objects. Whenever he is, whatever he touches, she touches, he collects. That is the reason why we have a collection in the novel. And as the love story in the novel ends sadly, he decides to build up a museum based on his collection. That is, all through the novel, the story the novel chronicles 8 years of their relationship, and all through all the objects that she touched, or all the visions, images, pictures, newspapers, TV programs, films they look at together, are also preserved in the museum.
Let me put it in another way. In this temple of a great collection, a great imperial collection, you were particularly interested in seeing the paintings by Bruegel. On your way to Bruegel, you go through a room with paintings particularly beloved by Rudolf II. They're perhaps not the most extraordinary paintings in the museum, but Rudolf II, again, they're very erotically charged things. Collections are something that always have to do with conquest and possession. And what more erotic words than those two?
Okay, my museum of, I'll talk here a bit long. I'll tell you about my theory of collecting, gathering. I argue towards the end of the novel, Museum of Innocence, that that it's common to human heart to collect, not to collect, gather objects. I argue that we fall in love, we are angry, some dramatical thing happens in our life, we feel jealous, we have a longing, then we attach our sentiment with an object. That happens a lot, especially with a picture. I lived all my life in Istanbul. Say I am very angry to a person, or I have a fight with another person, then I'm walking in a street, then I see an old fountain, a landscape. Next time I walk from that street or look from that view and see that angle, I remember my previous sentiments. Say I'm in love, then I see a fountain. Then 3 years later, when I come across that fountain, I may not be in love, but that sentiment comes back through the fountain. Thus, a city is a sort of an index for our memoirs. Once the buildings, architecture, bridges, streets, old houses are destroyed, the index, the way we reach our memories are also destroyed. That's why perhaps we want to preserve them. Objects of our daily lives. Say we go to a movie, then put the ticket in our pocket, then forget it for 20 years, then wear that jacket again and put our hands in the pocket and pick up that ticket 20 years later. And as soon as we have that object in our hands, then we also realize that we have seen that movie. We have completely forgotten that we have seen that movie. Not only that we realize that we've seen that movie, but the scenes, moments of that movie that we completely have forgotten comes back to us. This is a sort of objects trigger memories. Proust has discovered this already, but my take is that objects trigger memories. That's why we are attached to objects.
There's an interesting, well, there are always endless interesting questions about translations. Your book and indeed your museum are called a Museum of Innocence. Now, innocence, technically speaking, means not knowing. In German, the translation would be Unschuld, which would be not being guilty. At the same time, it is obviously a museum of somebody who knows, and somebody even who has become guilty. I mean, how he deals with the two women in his novel is not very nice. So, how come you've chosen this title?
Innocence doesn't necessarily mean not knowing.
I don't know what the Turkish word for innocence would mean.
Webster's dictionary defines, there are so many connotations of innocence. Not being guilty, yes, not knowing, not committing a crime, blah, 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 blah. And also Webster's dictionary defines innocence as artlessness or not being pretension. This is the connotation, and we also have that in Turkish. This, among many, also the book refers to cult of virginity, whether who killed my heroine at the end of the book. There are so many connotations. My strategy for choosing book titles is not neither explaining nor summing it up. When we read War and Peace, it is about war and peace. But my Museum of Innocence is not a war and peace kind of title. My titles are more enigmatic. It makes you ask this question, Mr. Pamuk, why did you choose that title? Just for you to ask this question so that you reconsider the book again. Titles don't explain the book, but it helps you rethink about your what you have read.
Well, your title has succeeded completely, obviously. This exhibition, to bring up another title, has the beautiful German title Fernweh, which means a longing for what's far away. Now, a longing for what's far away doesn't only need to be in space, it can also be in time. For instance, if one reconstructs a whole museum of the life of people 20, 40 years ago.
Yes, sure. But what is the question?
Well, is this a completely wrong impression that this longing for something that's far away has not only animated Cornell making these extraordinary boxes, which always dramatize something, often something that he's never seen. He dramatizes places that he's never seen, he dramatizes people who he's never met, and in fact often people who are dead a long time ago. And you've mentioned several times that part of your intention of creating this museum was dramatizing or displaying the lives of people, quite ordinary, normal people, who lived between the 1950s and the 1980s.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I was inviting you to elaborate on the similarity between these two approaches, I suppose.
Okay, I understand. Cornell has a desire to go about other places, other countries, other... for me, my main idea was to make a city museum out of ordinary things. For me, my desire was to pin down the reality and then say, this is how we ate, these are the food that we enjoyed, these are... So my museum is in fact not very Joseph by spirit, not a Joseph Cornell. Visually, it's Cornell-like. In its poetics and philosophy, it's about pinning down encyclopedic reality in full detail in a very accurate way. When I was doing Museum of Innocence, I behaved like a person who is doing a sort of an encyclopedia of daily life of Istanbul between 1950 and then end of 20th century. The desire for other worlds or was not, I did not have a desire for other Paris, which Cornell had. I was busy pinning down, categorizing, making beautiful or making look nice details of our lives in Istanbul. In that sense, my museum is not Cornell-like.
Is it a museum that dramatizes to a large extent your own youth and early life?
So you were asking this question that I've been, one of the most frequent things that I've been asked in my, after I published this book, which is a story of love, a man's extreme infatuation with his twice removed cousin. And of course, the typical question is asked is that, Mr. Pamuk, is protagonist you, meaning, did you fall in love that badly? And then my answer is, in fact, I wrote about this in a book, in my book, Naive and Sentimental Novelist. I argued that the conceit in art of fiction, especially in novels, is that as we read a novel, our imagination does so many things, one of which is this. We ask ourselves, is this autobiographical or is this invented by the writer? Are these details invented by a writer or by a creator who has a longing for other worlds, or is this just a very realistic, accurate thing? I did the museum for its realism, while, of course, even if you say, no, none of these details are autobiographical, I never fall in love that way, the reader will not believe you. Or if you say, yes, I fall in love even worse than my character, again, the reader will not believe you. The reader, as he or she reads a novel, knows that he or she is reading a novel. Thus, always thinking when the reader comes across a powerful detail, he or she asks this question: is this imagined or does it come from writer's real life? The interesting, dramatical thing about the Museum of Innocence is that it plays around, dramatizes this problem of fiction and reality. In fact, I may say that I did the whole museum to produce that effect. You read a novel, you spend 10 hours, 15 hours with a story, then you're told that there is also inside the book a free ticket. You're told that, oh, you know, this novel, you have read all the objects that are mentioned, and then the narrative voice in the novel tells that there is a museum. You can come to a museum, that this flower, this dress, this vision, this ticket, this object, this salt shaker is exhibited in Museum of Innocence in the house that Füsun and other characters live. So you go there tongue-in-cheek with a lot of irony, considering what is this? Is this guy mad? Pamuk, what did he do? So forth and so on. And then you come and you see this, all these objects that perhaps I exhibited, for example, you see these objects, and then there is an effect that we are accustomed to reading novels. We are aware that they are fictional. In the end, they are the products of writer's imagination, and at most, they are only words. And when you come to the museum, you see that they are not only words, they are objects seriously framed with a lot of consideration and so forth and so on. In the end, art of the novel, when we think of novels, well, we think of Robinson Crusoe. Daniel Defoe claimed that all the things that he wrote in his novel are real, he said, which was a lie. It was not real. He invented a lot. It was not his, he didn't live it. It was imaginary. And it was even in the newspapers claimed that it was imaginary. But we read, our imagination doesn't work that way. We read to believe it, sometimes true, sometimes false. Is it occurred? Is it not? Then we have that kind of imagination, and our minds are busy in that way. Once we think of a novel like this, and once you come then to the museum, then you see the reality of the objects, and you have a sense of dizziness, strangeness, whatever. That was the idea about Museum of Innocence.
This game with the documentary and the invented reminds very much of the sentence that artists have to lie to tell the truth, or to get perhaps at a deeper truth. But at the same time, to bring back this whole story to Vienna and to this building. In the Kunstkammer, you have many objects that take the extraordinary and the exotic and integrate it into the own world of the Europeans. They take a coconut shell, which was insanely precious then, or a different shell, and they make an object according to a European aesthetic. They integrate it into a European mythological context.
But they are not aware it's European. They think there is no national self-consciousness there. It's just...
There's a certain cultural consciousness,
yes, it's just very beautiful. I have this extraordinary, wonderful object. I'm displaying it. I'm happy that I own it. You see that I'm powerful and important because I own it. Please have a look at it. Aren't they nice? Didn't I frame it right? So forth and so on. Thus, lending us a sense of a museumness of a cabinet of curiosities. More or less, that's what I did to my extraordinarily ordinary objects. The difference between a Wunderkammer and Museum of Innocence, the difference between a Wunderkammer or a Joseph Cornell box is this, that Joseph Cornell box already recognizes the existence of museum of cabinets of curiosities or Wunderkammers. Thus, when we look at a Cornell box, we know the whole history of framing and putting things in boxes because we refer to museum Wunderkammers, cabinets of curiosities. We have a sense of frames, these wooden structures, the seriousness and gravitas of all the aristocracy of Europe, so forth and so on. At the back of our heads, there is this a sort of a slightly half semi-consciousness above history of art. You cannot enjoy Joseph Cornell without history of art, and you're aware of it. Then he is putting on pedestal and putting in frames regular daily life objects. In my Museum of Innocence, inside I was putting in frame, putting in Wunderkammer kind of cabinets and boxes, more rituals of eating, enjoying and surviving, details of life in Istanbul, secular life in Istanbul. The aims are different. If we go to the Wunderkammer here, the objects by themselves are extraordinary. We don't need to see the frame. And the frame or the box or the drawer is not that important because those objects are really extraordinary. While pop art behaves the same way, but the objects as well, and the Warhol's Coca-Cola or Campbell soup can or whatever, or all these objects that the Turks enjoyed, food or a teacup, are extremely regular, popular objects. The contrast here is to combine the prestige or importance of the Cabinet of Curiosities, Wunderkammer, with the popular art objects. The effect of, say, Andy Warhol or Joseph Cornell is based on this contradiction. My Museum of Innocence is doing that same thing, but is focusing more on habits, traditions, rituals, ways of doing things, and combining with tongue-in-cheek with the fictional story, producing something between imaginary documentary, something between a pop art museum and a city museum.
Every now and then, as an interviewer, you have the rare happiness that you're preparing to ask a question and your interviewee takes off and answers not only it, but much more than it. That's what you've just taken, and I want to thank you for that. But it is now time for you to put your questions to Orhan Pamuk. If you have questions, if you want to ask something, you have a Rolls-Royce of a mic carrier in the curator of the exhibition who will give you the word.
I have a questions concerning the boxes. You seem to work very systematically between your novels and the boxes. It seems you have a very clear system which you're working on. And I want to know, in terms of the boxes, how do you arrange your traditional objects or the daily objects? Is there a certain iconography or a certain system? How do you place them? Is that by chance? Is that a long-term plan?
As I just said, in the end, the dead artist in me, after I was around 50s, was discovering ways of making art. One way is, just like everyone, you do a sketch, as you see on the right side, and then I have all these objects, say this barometer, these pills, this major photo, which affected me so much that I put it in a book, in the story. I was collecting the objects as I was writing the novel, say the main character's jacket or her clothes. If I write about the clothes, then I have to go out in the streets and find that flowery cloth, which is impossible. Isn't it simpler that first I find what she wears, or first I find that photo, first I find that rakı glass you see in front, then I write about it in a catalog, or what I call the novel, then I put the object in a corresponding chapter 47 of that. This was one way of it doing. Another way of doing, as all the artists do, just we have the objects, we have the background, then let's do a try and error, try and error, take photographs each time. The hairy hand is my mind. The others were ladies who were helping me.
There's a question right there, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. I visited your museum with several people. I must say we were from different backgrounds because we were going at Koç University to a summer school. And we had a very, very interesting discussion after visiting the museum, where I must say that Philipp Blom's theory that there is an electric charge was in fact the prevailing theme of the discussion. All of us were thinking that the boxes had very, very strong erotic messages and narratives, and all of us were in fact...
I told Philip not to open this subject, and you're doing that again.
But I am also saying that, in fact, there is a correspondence between your novel and the museum, and that it seems that you are teasing all of us into thinking that, in fact, parts of the dresses, for instance, were taken from, yes, a personal experience. And when one goes up to the 3rd floor, where there is this bedroom, then, of course, that is a culminating point. I mean, I wonder whether you're just teasing us or whether you're now saying, well, no, it's all about rituals.
Okay. And there are two questions. First, about eroticism in the museum. Yes, there is a lot of eroticism in Museum of Innocence. Please come to Istanbul and see it. Second, am I teasing? Yes, I am teasing, but that's a small point about my museum. There is, as in all art and literature, some teasing, but it's not only about that. It's beyond that. Thanks.
Is it on? Yeah. I wonder if you'd say a few words about the movie Innocence of Memories.
Oh, okay.
Please.
Okay. Then maybe I'll go. So there is a novel, which was in a museum that I conceived together. Actually, the novel was going to be a sort of a catalog. But then, once the museum is finished, I saw that visuality, we call it beauty, or the visual effect of the museum, which is now a reality, not something that my characters or myself fantasizing about. Now there is a real museum. So I decided to make a catalog, a third thing out of the whole project. Then British film director, documentary film director, Grant G. got in touch with me. He visited the museum, read the novel, said he wanted to do a documentary about it, to which I agreed. Then we began brainstorming, developing ideas. Then we came to the idea that some secondary, small character, I will write text for the secondary character, which is in the novel. Unless you are a very careful reader, you won't remember her. She is one of the Füsun, the heroine's friend. She leaves town, Istanbul, for 12 years, comes back in 2000 something, and I wrote lines for her. I also wrote lines about memory, remembering, and also gave Grant G. permission to quote from my other books. Thus, he created this movie, which I thought will be 40 minutes of documentary one day I may watch in Arte or some serious, boring TV. But it ended up being 19-minute normal film, and more than we expected, it was accepted in Venice Film Festival as a serious, more normal film. So we had Innocence of Memories, the title of the film, was released shown for the first time in Venice Film Festival. I enjoyed the red carpet of Venice Film Festival. It was not in my life program, and now it will be released in many countries or many televisions soon.
Jasper, where are you?
Right here.
You're right there. Is there another question from the audience? Please.
Well, I lived all my life, almost all my life in Istanbul, and I read the book. I didn't have the chance to go to the museum. Yet, those objects that you showed in one of the slides, the brands, the way objects look, the grippin, ashtray, these were part of my life, and they create, as you said, some sentimentalism, some feelings in me. They raise that. My question is, I mean, it's a great idea, it's a great experiment, yet would it create the same effect in an international arena? Would it be, I mean, it's really fantastic. It creates epiphany. It's fantastic for me. The idea, the experiment, the book, the museum, amazing. But would it create the same effect on international people? Because we know that Turkey has changed throughout the years.
It's a very paradoxical question. I was sometimes blamed for writing for international people, and sometimes I'm blamed for writing only for Turks. And I don't know how to answer. That's the paradox of my art. But isn't the joy of reading books is that they are, although they are based on particular people's particular time and space, but the beauty of literature and art is that it transgresses that time and is enjoyed by everyone. My books are translated to 63 languages. There are millions of people who are enjoying them, and none of them had been to Istanbul. Maybe, yes, some artworks do not travel, but then they do. In fact, a selection from my museum, some of these 12, 13, some of them Cornell-like, some of them different units will be exhibited in London at the end of January. We will then see whether artworks travel or are only doomed for wherever they were produced. I agree with you. The whole question of museology is how do we have the right to pick up objects from 16th century tradition and put them in, say, New York and look at them and feel the same thing, enjoy them, exhaust their possibilities in the same way with the idea, the same way they were produced. Not at all. That, yes, objects, works of art and literature change meaning as they go from continents, from countries, from languages. One thing I know, that poetry may not translate, but novels and pictures definitely translate, not as strong and easy as music, but yes, humanity, thank God, has the capacity to enjoy texts and works of art that were produced by different cultures, civilizations, periods. But then we had Montaigne, who discovered that humanity enjoys, our hearts are similar. When someone falls in love and begins to gather objects, then we understand his or her infatuation. Human sentiments travel, thank God, so fast that art and literature is understandable by everyone.
There really could not be a better closing sequence to this evening than this idea that art translates, and perhaps we make different things out of it, but perhaps it's not less rich for that. I hand over for Jasper, and I thank you all for your patient and engaged listening, and I thank especially Orhan Pamuk that he's made the way from Istanbul here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I'm just going to say a very quick couple of thank yous to people who've helped put this talk and all of the talks during the Joseph Cornell exhibition together. I had thought that the greatest privilege of doing this exhibition in this extraordinary museum would be the exhibition itself, but I have to say, standing here listening to the two of you talk and to the other guests we've had during the last 3 months has been an absolute privilege. So also from my side, thank you enormously. Joseph Cornell was once asked by an interviewer who he thought were the greatest artists of his time. And he scratched his head and he looked at the interviewer and he said, "What do you mean by my time?" For Cornell, time was a continuum. It went from the cave painters through the Egyptians, through Dürer, up to him. And I like to think that Cornell's concept of time would definitely have included Philipp and Orhan as well. I'd like to thank very much the Verein der Freunde of the Kunsthistorisches Museum for supporting this talks program, the wonderful contemporary patrons of the Kunsthistorisches Museum who accompany this entire contemporary program, the Hotel Sans Souci, Wittmann for the wonderful, beautiful, comfortable armchairs that these two gentlemen are sitting in, all of my museum colleagues who helped put these talks together. The exhibition Joseph Cornell will be open now for another 45 minutes, if you haven't seen it, in Saal 8, just the other way, and it will be on until the 10th of January. Raise your glass on December the 24th. You will probably all be doing that anyway, but raise it again for Joseph Cornell, and let's wish him all a happy birthday. Next year is a very special year for the Kunsthistorisches Museum. We celebrate our 125th birthday. We will be celebrating it all year long. When it is your birthday next year, you can come to this museum and come in for free. Bring your identity card or your driving license or your signed copy of the Museum of Innocence, and that won't work, but bring it anyway, and come to the museum for free on your birthday next year. Our talks program, we will invite the directors of these 5 extraordinary museums, the Rijksmuseum, the National Gallery of London, the Uffizi in Florence, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the Städel Museum in Frankfurt. They will all come to talk about the histories of their museums, where they are today, and where they are going over the next 50 or 100 years. Right outside, on the other side of this magic curtain, is a beautiful table of books by Orhan and Philipp. No one is allowed to leave without buying at least one. They're fabulous. I'd like to thank Philipp and Orhan enormously. We need to put a drink in your hands. And on behalf of Sabine Hager, director, and the Kunsthistorisches Museum, a very happy Christmas to all of you. Thank you very much.